Hello, everyone. Today, I'm going to summarize the JonBenét case. Tragically, all evidence points to Patsy, and I will show you why. Sources like graphics and video clips presented fall under the Fair Use Act in the Copyright Act. Fair use permits a party to use a copyrighted work without copyright's owner permission for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. I am the author of Handwriting Analysis Principles. My name is Marcel Elfers. I am also the author of JonBenét, the Final Chapter, where handwriting analysis, statement analysis, and behavioral trend analysis meet. In this summary, I will show the multidiscipline approach I used. The evidence overwhelmingly points to Patsy. This is unfortunate, as I believe the child's demise was accidental. We will be going over general observations, handwriting analysis, emotional impact, statement analysis, and behavioral trend analysis. Again, combined, all point to Patsy. And as a generality, the evidence is overwhelming. Locard's principle states that anyone who comes and goes brings and takes something to and from that location. There were 0 signs an intruder was in the house, which violates this principle. No debris, no fingerprints, no shoe prints, nothing was out of place, nothing taken out of the fridge, etc. And that strongly suggests there was no intruder. The touch DNA found on her clothing is not substantial and came likely from a factory worker who packaged the clothing items she was wearing. John confirmed all doors were locked. Since doors were locked from the inside, the Ramseys claimed the intruder came through the basement window. Somebody can indeed climb through the basement window. It is physically problematic, yet possible. But not without disturbing the dust and debris on the windowsill. The windowsill was undisturbed. The basement window was below ground and had a window well. A grate covered the opening to protect people from falling in. We can see the opening is rather narrow. A cobweb attached the wall with the grate. Removing the grate would break the cobweb and it would no longer be attached. It was December, and spiders are not active in wintertime. The undisturbed cobweb, as well as the undisturbed windowsill, proves nobody entered through the basement window. The Ramseys then came up with somebody must have had a key, entered the home during their absence, and waited for hours for them to come back. Again, Locard's principle still applies, and there was 0 evidence. The main piece of evidence, and the most crucial one, is the rambling 2.5-page ransom note. A normal ransom note would be short, likely typed, and brought in by an intruder in preparation for the anticipation of the kidnapping. This ransom note was 2.5 pages long, and that is highly unusual. The note, or should I say the letter, was written on a notepad belonging to the Ramseys. In other words, the alleged intruder wrote the ransom note in the home. The Sharpie used also belonged to the Ramseys, and that was proven by ink comparison. The Sharpie was also placed back in the canister it belonged to. Interestingly, the letter was left behind on the stairwell the parents typically come down from. The letter was on the 3rd step, which would be a natural placement for a person of Patsy's height. Of course, anyone can place it on the 3rd step, but it would be a natural for Patsy. The ransom note demanded money for a supposed kidnapping for a now dead child who was left behind in the home of the parents. That is nonsensical. JonBenét's body was left behind in the basement. An intruder would have left the home without writing the note. As we will see shortly, the author of the ransom note was emotionally impacted by her demise. And that suggests strongly the ransom note was written after, and I repeat, after she met her fate. There was no intruder. Nobody came in through the basement window. The doors were locked. Kidnappers bring a note. No kidnapper leaves a body behind and still demands a ransom note, written after her demise. This storyline makes no sense. Is fabrication by highly anxious individuals not being used to being a criminal. The writer had no criminal mindset. And that makes us think of parents, for instance. The principle behind handwriting comparison analysis is that no two people write exactly the same. And nobody writes exactly the same twice. Two writers are highly likely one and the same author when there are many similar handwriting characteristics. The ransom note is the one and only crucial piece of evidence. It is therefore most important to determine who wrote the note. The why is initially secondary. In this case, Patsy's writing and the author of the ransom note are overwhelmingly similar. Let's have a look. People can deliberately change their handwriting, or so it seems. What people do not realize is that handwriting is a behavior driven by a mental image of what a letter should look like. We basically form a letter by copying a mental image. People who are forced to write with their non-dominant hand, for instance after a stroke, will eventually write the same as their previous dominant hand. The first paragraph of the ransom note is extremely shaky, revealing a high degree of anxiety. The last paragraph is fluid and smooth, This suggests not only anxiety, but also the potential for the author trying to obscure his or her identity while using their non-dominant hand. The attempt to disguise authorship suggests the author was known to the family. The author used a hooded letter A in the ransom note, but it appears was not used to using this shape. We can see that in two ways. First, the hoods of the A are very inconsistent. That is unusual. Compare, for instance, the A's in deviation and immediate. Second, the A in to a stray dog was corrected by adding the hood later. The same thing happened in the letter T, which was also corrected after the fact by adding the bottom crossbar. This suggests the author attempted to disguise. An unknown intruder has no significant need to disguise their writing. This author willfully and deliberately attempted to disguise their writing, and that implies the author was known to the family. Here are a few slides comparing Patsy's writing with the ransom note author. The first stem of the M is partially retraced, with the hump extending above the height of the stem. The middle stem does not come down to the baseline, and the final period floats above the baseline. Patsy and the ransom note author have the same characteristics. Although the writing is not exact, which is to be expected since nobody writes exactly the same twice, the handwriting characteristics are virtually the same. Here is another similarity that we subconsciously make. In these mid-zone eyes, we see a little backward bend, and they also drop mildly below the baseline. The period of the exclamation mark drops below the baseline, both in the ransom note as well as Patsy is used to doing that. People that drop their mid-zone eyes letter below the baseline and drop the periods below the baseline, which is virtually the same behavior, these people tend to be to have an enthusiastic mindset and can overdo things. The mid-zone eye dots are positioned similarly, both in location as they relate to the stem, as well as in height. The T's, like the mid-zone eyes, also drop below the baseline. The C has an extended bottom forward thrust stroke. Patsy is used to doing that, and that returns in the ransom note. The O shrinks, and the combination COU is disconnected. The ransom note author appears to connect COU. However, they are simply cramped up without forming a connecting stroke. The similarities in the letter S are also striking. The bottom of the S is heavier, let's say fuller formed. And the top falls short, passing the bottom curve. And the S's tend to slant backwards. The TH combination is also similar. We see that the H stem is consistently higher than the height of the T stem. And they are roughly at the same ratio. Both Patsy and the ransom note author invade the lower zone. That is, the sentence below moves through the lower zone structures of the sentence above. The handwriting comparison evidence points to Patsy as the author, and the inaptness of quote-unquote this intruder shows in the rambling ransom note. Still, we do not know so far what happened, nor who killed JonBenét. Again, there are 3 people in the home: John, Patsy, and the almost 10-year-old Burke. The writer of the ransom note was highly anxious. Let's have a look. The writer was emotionally impacted while writing the letter. In the sentence, "She is safe and unharmed," we see the word unharmed is cramped up and the unportion is separated from harmed. This enlargement shows this clearly. The writer paused momentarily after un, and the harmed portion is cramped up. Both imply an intrusive thought occurred, increasing the author's anxiety, suggesting the author was emotionally attached to JonBenét. And here is the thing. For an alleged intruder to calmly sit down in the home for probably an hour while being unconcerned about being caught with a dead body in the basement is counterintuitive. The anxiety in the writing behavior and the calmly sitting down to write a 2.5-page ransom note does not match. Every word we use has an emotional value to us. Word selection is a mindset expressed, and we use statement analysis for that. What we have so far is an anxiety-driven, rambling ransom note written in the home. There is no intruder, and the writer is more likely attached to JonBenét, like a parent. The ransom note changed from group perspective to singular perspective, as we see in the words we, our, I, and my. A change in word is a change in reality. The quote-unquote foreign faction as a group is likely fabricated. The alleged intruder writes the ransom note in the home while the parents are sleeping upstairs and advises them to rest. That is nonsensical and strongly points to fabrication. The author imagines this outside the reality of the context they find themselves in. An intruder writing the note with the parents sleeping would not think of advising them to rest because they are resting already. Rule number 1 of the rules of engagements is we always talk about what we relate to. Patsy is the author of the ransom note, and she was exhausted. She needed to rest herself, having been up all night, and is why that sentence appears in the ransom note in the first place. The letter was addressed to Mr. Ramsey, and the line, "If you want her to see 1997, is written from the perspective of the child. It says, "If you want JonBenét to see 1997. Since the letter was addressed to Mr. Ramsey, this sentence should have read, "And if you want to see her in 1997. And that would have been written from the perspective of the person who was addressed, Mr. Ramsey, John. If you want her to see 1997 also implies she may not see 1997. It's a kind of a warning. And since we always talk about what we relate to, or what is important to us, this line specifically, in combination with the emotional impact on the word unharmed, strongly suggests that the writer knew the child was dead already. A kidnapper would have left without writing the note. The note was simply created to create an alibi. And again, there were only 3 people left in the home: John, Patsy, and Burke. The ransom note had more odd sentences. For instance, "We respect your business, but not the country that it serves." That implies the Ramseys were targeted because they are American, not because they are, quote unquote, the Ramseys. Why would a kidnapper kidnap a child in a small town like Boulder, Colorado? And why not in a big city with more options available to a kidnapper? That is nonsensical. Notice also the sentence probably read originally, "We don't respect," while the "do not" was scored out. Again, a change in words is a change in reality. The sentence, "and hence an earlier pickup of your daughter," has delivery scored out. There is no kidnapper in the world who would risk getting caught by delivering a child and then changes their mind to pick up. And the sentence, "do particularly like you," was changed to "do not particularly like you." The change in mindset of liking John to not liking John completely goes against the notion of FBI profiler John Douglas that it was, quote, "somebody very angry with John," unquote. Nobody with a distaste for somebody so strong they are willing to kidnap a child will have a mindset to like somebody. I meant not like. Let's face it. This writer is not a criminal, has no criminal mindset, and had no kidnapping in mind. This is total fabrication. The rambling ransom note was not the only odd and out of place sentence. In the 9/11 call, Patsy did not prioritize JonBenét, suggesting involvement. The operator felt the statements were rehearsed. The Ramseys were not cooperative with law enforcement and lawyered up almost immediately. On January 1st, 1997, 5 days after the murder, they had a CNN interview which was broadcasted nationwide. Mr. Cabell asked, "Why did you decide you wanted to talk now?" "Well," said John, "people that use well or other words that are buying time need more time to think about an answer. The use of a garrote is willful and deliberate, and to call a deliberate murder a quote-unquote tragedy is downplaying the act. Guilty people downplay as they do not see themselves as murderers." John then thanked the public for their support. Why is he not taking the opportunity to ask the public emphatically and impassionately for help at this moment in time, at the beginning of the interview? Well, nobody has left the interview yet. Remember, we always talk about that what is important to us first. Finding the murderer was not a priority. And that suggests they know there was no intruder. Patsy was a type 2 according to the Enneagram. She was a caring, interpersonal type, generous to a fault, demonstrative, and people-pleasing in the name of earning love and appreciation. Patsy was a socialite and lived her past through JonBenét. 2s are empathetic, sincere, and warm-hearted. They are friendly, generous, and self-sacrificing, and can become emotionally attached, flattering, and even people-pleasing. They are well-meaning and driven to be close to others, but they can slip into doing things for others in order to be needed. They typically have problems with possessiveness and acknowledging their own needs. The core perspective of a type 2 is, I must be good to others first, or I will not be loved. At average to unhealthy mental health levels, type 2s will provide unwanted and unneeded advice. Keep that in mind for now. Type 2s process information through their feelings, their emotions. They primarily feel and then react to those feelings, which makes them emotional and reactive. Emotional reactivity goes at the cost of reasoning, which typically happens under stress and high degree of anxiety. Type 2s then become unhinged and dominant when cornered. That loss of control and emotional reactivity returns in the ransom note. People who drop letters through the baseline, like we have seen with the T's and the mid-zone I's, lose control over their impulses and come into action to meet their subconscious needs. Letters like the personal pronoun I, mid-zone I's, and T's are specifically significant, as they are personal and linked to the need to achieve and come into action. Loss of control, emotional reactivity, and overdoing things. And Patsy was known to do everything, quote unquote, Texas style. And that is consistent with a way too long ransom note and excessive dress code for JonBenét. The length of the letter implies uncontrollable urges and emotional reactivity. Again, we see that in the dropping of the letters in the midzone I's, T's, and also personal pronoun I's. These people typically undermine authority. Patsy, the now known author, provided unwanted advice, as in, quote unquote, to be rested, and is also good to other people by staying polite despite the circumstances, by calling the hardcore criminals gentlemen. Type 2s must be good to others and are socially polite. We have just seen that. We also see that in respect your business. And the writer of the note shows the willingness to accommodate to others, as in, if there is an earlier delivery, we will adapt. John also made several statements in interviews that are odd. He referred to the alleged murder as a tragedy, implying tragedy implies an unintentional event. In other words, a quote-unquote accident. He also made the statement, there is no answer, implying there is no need to look for one either. And the statement, we need to know why it happened for us to move on, implies no need to know what happened, which would lead to the murderer. These statements directly point to accident. There was no intruder, and there is no need to look for one. So, Patsy wrote the note, and that means Patsy took the initiative. That also suggests she was the most motivated to cover the event up. The question now is, who is she covering up for? Is that John? Patsy Burke? But one thing is for sure, no loving, caring, generous mother, or father for that matter, would cover up for a stranger, an intruder. Patsy wrote a note, and you're not going to cover up for an intruder. It is interesting to see that the first page of the ransom note shows a demanding and domineering attitude. And we can see that in the words like listen, exclamation mark. You must, you will, make sure that, you will, etc. This represents a potential intruder who is dominant and demanding. And that mimics a kidnapper's mindset. So far, so good. The first half of the second page, however, shows some kindness and adaptability from the perspective of the alleged kidnappers. The words like advice, might, gentleman, and again advice suggest that adaptability. This is unusual, as kidnappers must and need to maintain control. The second half is downright vile. We already know the author knew the child was dead at the time of the writing. We saw that in the emotional impact in the word unharmed and the sentence, if you want her to see 1997. Patsy, as the author of the note, is setting the expectation the child is dead already. Patsy likely was reminded in her mind JonBenét was dead at this time of writing the letter. She uses half a page to explain the child may die, and she does that 4 times, is beheaded or will be beheaded and or killed. This again is an emotional overreaction. Half a page of death threats. And that suggests Patsy, as the author, is deeply hurt. She is devastated and cannot believe the situation she found herself in. The last page is a plea to John, now no longer called Mr. Ramsey, but called the more personal John. The plea is about not to tell what happened. Do not grow a brain, John. It's up to you now, John. The last line is particularly interesting, as Patsy is telling John that he is now in charge of what comes next. So Patsy wrote a note, Patsy took the initiative, and she was motivated to coerce John into cooperation. Patsy basically admits John knows something about her. John's cooperation suggests he did not kill JonBenét, or he would not have to be coerced. For him to cooperate suggests Patsy knows something nefarious about John. Why else would he cooperate to an elaborate plan to cover up the death of his daughter for years? Patsy was the most motivated. Exaggeration is an indication of the opposite. When you hear a flower vase break in the living room, the child that yells the loudest, "I didn't do it," is the one who did. Exaggeration in behavior is a release of pent-up energy that comes with high levels of anxiety. Who is she protecting? It's not John. And that leaves Patsy or Burke. Again, exaggeration is an indication of high levels of anxiety, pent-up energy. And looking someone in the eye when lying increases anxiety out of fear of getting caught. This is why people look away, to reduce that anxiety. In interviews with John, we see an increase in anxiety behaviors at times when John is asked about Patsy's involvement. He does not get anxious when asked about Burke. When things get a little too close to the truth, anxiety sets in and behavior changes to release that nervous energy. And the increase in anxiety and change in behavior suggests John knows about Patsy's involvement. Here are 2 examples of John's anxiety behavior. In the Anderson Cooper interview, John faces Anderson and is engaged consistently in this manner. He sits, has his hands on his lap, and he faces Anderson Cooper. This is his baseline behavior. When he was asked what happened, he mentioned, quote unquote, this person, which is a downplay of a murderer, and looks down for an all too brief moment. He could not face Anderson, and that implies deception. This person is non-existent. John got really anxious when asked whether Patsy was involved. He was asked, is there any way Patsy could have been involved? And he veered instantly away from his normal pattern of looking at Anderson Cooper and suddenly could not face him. Then he sped up his speech pattern and his voice pitched much higher. These are anxiety traits and a release of nervous energy. He knows there was no intruder. He knows Patsy wrote the note, and he knows exactly what happened. And asking about Patsy's involvement is simply too close for comfort. In the Larry King interview, some 3 years after her demise, Steve Thomas, the lead investigator, and the Ramseys met. In that interview, Patsy stated, quote unquote, whoever wrote the note is the killer. And she said that with conviction and enthusiasm. Well, Patsy, you wrote the note. Steve Thomas stated, Patsy could have been arrested in this case, and she replied, I wish I would have been, and we would have a free and fair trial, and you would have met your Waterloo. And as soon as she said Waterloo, she stopped facing Steve Thomas and Larry King and looked down for half a second to a second. She lost her confidence. And that suggests she is not so sure Steve Thomas would have met her Waterloo because she knows the evidence will point to her. Immediately after that, John went into the offense. He became offensive. Every sentence that he spoke to Steve Thomas, claiming, you are accusing my wife of murder, was emphasized with raising his hand and point his finger to Steve Thomas. Again, things came too close to Patsy being accused of being the murderer, and his anxiety increased, and the release of nervous energy is once again obvious. I do believe that Steve Thomas's theory that it was a bedwetting accident and that's why she got killed because Patsy lost control is most likely not the correct one. I do believe something else happened, and I have shown that in another video. I hope you enjoyed that. You will see in the description the videos I have used.